We discussed in our last set of slides how to acquire merchandise. We talked about the process for buying national brand merchandise, and we talked about how to source store brand merchandise. The last part of that acquiring merchandise process comes in negotiating with our vendors. So like I mentioned, when we're negotiating with our suppliers for national brands or sourcing private label merchandise, there are a few things that we should be ready to negotiate. And a lot of times this negotiation is not going to happen at the wholesale market or at the trade show, but it's going to happen once the buyer has gone back to their office, taken some time to really look through financials to see what they can afford to buy, and then they're going to either go to the supplier's office or they're going to meet in a neutral location to negotiate pricing for products. And so we're going to talk about negotiating price, but we're also going to talk about really 5 other areas that a buyer should negotiate with a vendor to try to help with the process of acquiring merchandise. So you do want to talk about price and gross margin. The buyer obviously wants to pay less for the merchandise in order to be able to achieve higher margins. But the vendor wants to get a higher price for the merchandise to really cover their margins, to cover their own margins, because the vendor needs to be profitable as well as the retailer being profitable. So that's a piece that you're going to want to talk about. And you're also going to want to negotiate in, you're talking about maybe a way to kind of alleviate some of the stress on the retailer is maybe discussing last season's merchandise and whether or not a vendor would be willing to take back last season's merchandise and return that to help alleviate some of the pricing issues to achieve gross margin. Additional markup opportunities are something that you can negotiate with a vendor if you are a buyer. The vendor might offer discounted prices to the buyer on excess inventory. So just like we talked about in price and gross margin, a lot of times retailers will try to return merchandise to the vendor in order to get a break on some of the pricing, so that they can better achieve their gross margins. So in this type of negotiation, a retailer might try to buy some of that excess merchandise that the vendor has, and the vendor might have excess merchandise because of order cancellations, returned merchandise, or overly optimistic sales forecasts on their part. And so by buying these discounted inventory pieces, the buyer can achieve higher than normal gross margins when they sell it in their store. But what does this mean for the retailer? Because if you're buying excess inventory from last season, especially if it's fashion merchandise, this could really tarnish your reputation because you're selling leftover merchandise or last season's merchandise. So while additional markup opportunities can be really beneficial for a retailer, the retailer really has to consider their retail strategy and understand what could happen if they sold leftover merchandise. The third point of negotiation would be terms of purchase. Buyers tend to want to negotiate longer payment terms. Longer payment terms help improve cash flow. It often lowers the retailer's liabilities, and it can reduce interest expense. A lot of times retailers have to borrow money to buy merchandise. And so by being able to negotiate longer payment terms and paying over time or paying at the end of seasons gives the buyer or the retailer some flexibility. Now, on the flip side of that, the vendor obviously wants to be paid immediately and in full as much as can be. So this is part of the terms of purchase that the retailer and the vendor are going to negotiate during the merchandise buying process. Exclusivity is another point of negotiation that a retailer can discuss with a vendor. Buyers often want to negotiate that no other retailer can sell the same item. Sometimes the buyer wants to negotiate that no other retailer can sell the same brand. Now, why would the buyer want exclusivity. Well, exclusivity allows differentiation. It allows the buyer to differentiate themselves on unique merchandise. And it also enables them to charge higher prices and therefore get higher margins on those products. Now, from a vendor's perspective, exclusivity is beneficial because their image remains consistent with the retailer's image. And if the retailer has an image for high quality exclusive merchandise, that manufacturer, that vendor will reap those benefits as well. Now, the downside for the vendor is if you're only selling a product at Target, that means you're not selling it at Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, Kroger, etc. And so you could lose quite a bit of sales from customers who would buy the product if it was at their store or a store of their choice. But exclusivity is a good point to negotiate. You also want to try to negotiate advertising allowances. Retailers often share the cost of advertising with vendors through a co-op advertising program. And in a co-op advertising program, the vendor actually pays part of or all of the advertising for that product. Buyers, of course, want vendors to provide advertising allowances. I have a fun example of advertising allowances. When I worked for the paint company, we sold our product into both Home Depot and Lowe's, and actually into Walmart as well. And when we were working with Home Depot and Lowe's, have you ever wondered like how Home Depot chooses which product to put into their weekly ad or which products to feature on their website? Well, a lot of times, the vendor, and in that case, my paint company, we were the vendor and we were selling our product into Home Depot and Lowe's and Walmart, and we would offer to pay a co-op advertising. So we'll pay a portion of your advertising costs. You just have to agree to feature us in the ad, right? So that's good for the retailer because they get help advertising their entire store, and it's good for the vendor because they get featured in the store's advertisements. So advertising allowances are a very good point to try to negotiate to help reduce costs for the retailer. And the last point to negotiate is transportation. When I'm talking about transportation, that's the cost of the freight to get the merchandise from the vendor to the retail establishment. Cost of shipping merchandise is exceptionally high. Freight, transportation, all of that costs a lot of money. And so a point to negotiate when meeting with your vendor is who pays for shipping. Obviously, the vendor wants the retailer to pay it, and the retailer wants the vendor to pay it, but maybe you can meet halfway and maybe you can each pay partial instead of having one person take on that cost. That is a point of negotiation. So that wraps up our discussion on acquiring merchandise, with the last piece being this negotiation and what a retailer should try to negotiate when acquiring merchandise. We're going to wrap up this chapter by talking about legal and ethical issues in buying merchandise. One of the biggest issues in buying merchandise is counterfeit merchandise. And when we talk about counterfeit merchandise includes goods made and sold without the permission of the owner of the trademark or the copyright. So a lot of items that are commonly counterfeited are handbags, accessories, music, and software. This is actually a chart from Homeland Security, and they have a task force that works on discovering counterfeit merchandise. And so you can see even from 2014 to 2015, the 2015 data just came out at the end of April, and in 2015, the United States seized almost 29,000 counterfeit shipments in the United States. In 2000, that's up from 2014 when there were only 23,000. It's kind of interesting to look at what are the most counterfeit items being brought into the United States. There were over 6,000 seizures of wearing apparel and accessories. Accessories would be sunglasses. They might be belts, etc. Consumer electronics was the next highest. Footwear. And if you look at 2014 to 2015, footwear has actually increased as far as counterfeits. In 2014, only 5% of seizures were footwear, and 10% of seizures were footwear in 2015. So what does this equate to in dollars? When we talk about counterfeit merchandise, this impacts the retailer because the retailer is not making sales because people are moving to this counterfeit merchandise. So if we look at sales dollars, in 2015, the United States seized $1.3 billion in counterfeit merchandise, $580 million in watches and jewelry, $208 million in handbags and wallets. This is what the cost to the retailer would be. If the retailer sold the actual product at the manufacturer's suggested retail price, this is the cost. This is what counterfeit merchandise costs retailers every year. Counterfeit merchandise is illegal, not just unethical, but illegal. So let's talk about a couple other legal and ethical issues. Gray market goods. So when we talk about gray market goods, they are legal, and I'll let you decide whether or not they're ethical. Gray market goods involve the flow of merchandise through distribution channels across international borders. Okay, so it's the flow of merchandise across international borders, but it's not intended by the manufacturer. So what do I mean by this? A lot of times, manufacturers or retailers will produce different versions of items for different countries. An example would be textbooks. Textbooks are one of the most commonly distributed gray market goods. And McGraw-Hill, for example, let's take a textbook publisher, they will produce a slightly different version of the book to be sold in the United States, a slightly different version to be sold in Europe, Asia, South America, and in other countries, the prices might be lower so that people can afford to buy them. Well, McGraw-Hill charges higher prices in the United States. And so a lot of times people will ship, third parties will ship textbooks from other countries into the United States that might be the slightly different version that they can get at a slightly lower price and then resell them here in the United States so that people can pay less. Another common gray market good would be video games. A lot of times, video game manufacturers will produce the same game under a different name in different countries. And the only difference in the game is the name and the picture on the cover of the case. And so, video games that are made for Japan will often be priced much lower than the same video game made for the United States. And so gray market good would be those Japan versions of the video game ending up for sale in the United States so that people can pay less. Diverted merchandise is very, very similar to gray market merchandise, except the merchandise is not transported across international borders. So this is merchandise that is sold through unintended distribution channels in the United States. And this might be an exclusive merchandise that's purchased by a retailer from a vendor and then sold to off-price retailers if they had excess inventory. So imagine, and this is a completely made up example, but imagine that Saks Fifth Avenue has an exclusive perfume line that they get from a vendor, but then they have excess merchandise, so they in turn sell it to TJ Maxx. Well, the manufacturer is going to lose money, and Saks Fifth Avenue is a diverter. I'm actually going to post a link about Costco and Crocs for you in the module 4 that I'd like you to read. But Crocs does not sell their product into Costco, but Costco is able to acquire the merchandise through a diverted goods third-party seller. And so they're able to sell a lot of brands in their store, even though they don't purchase them from a manufacturer. So I'd be interested in your take on that article, on what you think, if Crocs is doing something ethical or unethical. It's very legal. But whether or not it's ethical is up to personal opinion. So I'd love to see a discussion of that in our forum. I'd also be interested to see if you can find any other examples of diverted merchandise in the United States. All right, so the next legal and ethical issue that we're going to talk about are black markets. Now, black markets are illegal in the United States, and a black market occurs when consumer goods are scarce. And so this could be water or maybe gas after a natural disaster. Black markets occur when consumer goods are scarce, when they're heavily taxed. So cigarettes and alcohol are often found on the black market. And black markets can also occur when consumer goods are illegal, drugs and guns sold on the black market. Black markets barely exist in the United States, but they do operate heavily in other countries. So an example that could have happened, for example, when we had Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans was out of water, they were out of gas, they were out of heating generators, electrical generators, heated blankets, etc. If someone were to purchase a large amount of those from the northern United States, drive them down there and sell them at an exceptionally high price, that's an example of a black market. And it is illegal in the United States. Commercial bribery is another issue in buying merchandise. Commercial bribery occurs when a vendor asks a buyer for something of value to influence the purchase decision. Commercial bribery is illegal in the United States. This could be if a vendor or a buyer were to take the other to lunch at a fancy restaurant, or if the vendor were to pay for the buyer and his family to take a trip out to the East Coast to test the merchandise. These gifts can be seen as bribes, and bribes are illegal. Bribes are illegal. They cannot persuade the buyer to purchase merchandise from a specific manufacturer. And it also goes the other way. The buyer cannot bribe the vendor to offer them lower prices. So I want to know what you think. Consider the differences among counterfeit, gray market, and black market merchandise. Do you believe that selling these types of merchandise should be allowed? Like I said, take a look at that Costco article. Let me know if you can find other examples of counterfeit or gray market or black market sales, and let me know what you think. Would you purchase a counterfeit wallet? How about a counterfeit prescription medication? What are your take on some of these issues in buying merchandise?